Good afternoon, colleagues. Our section will begin with introduction. We have panelists who are going to answer my questions. Taras Ivashchenko from Ozone, Sergei Gordeychik, CEO from Cyberus Open Code, CyberOk, Dmitry Orkin, Service Development Yandex Cloud, Vladimir Bengin, Director of Cybersecurity, Ministry of Digital Development, Denis Koroblev, Positive Technologies Executive Director, and myself, an independent expert. Thank you. Colleagues, our subject is quite interesting because many of you face open source on a regular basis and use different kind of open source software, including cybersecurity area. Some people make their contributions to open source, and it's a good subject for raising skills and getting better reputation in the market. But starting from February 24, a lot of foreign companies who prevailed in the Russian market in cybersec stopped their activities here or withdrew from the Russian market, and many companies face a big question mark, and they face a choice. Some of them, about 17%, are ready to wait until the foreign companies come back because they invested a lot and they cannot just waste that money. Others say we're going to refocus and call on Middle East, Israel, China, South America, whoever is ready to help. But if we ask them specifically, they are on leave. Sometimes other people don't answer. It's a difficult subject to discuss. And there is one more alternative. That using local software. And the fourth alternative, if you spend the money already and you cannot spend as much for a renewal alternative, we can use open source. And question one is for Sergei. Can we use open source to close all the gaps in corporate enterprise cybersecurity, technologically and large-scale gaps in territorially distributed companies with hundreds of offices without centralized management? Theoretically, yes, we can, but the answer is how much are you going to spend? Because open source doesn't mean free soft. Because if you just use open source, then you must rely on a certain vendor. And the vendor solves your problems instead of you. If you use classical open source, if you download it from Git, and start improving it from scratch, then you solve all those problems yourself, and it also costs money. Building a large-scale system based on open source, requires good R&D resources. We have two representatives of high-tech companies with such resources and who are going that way. Who do you mean? Yandex and Open. Well, let's start with the O company, Taras. How did you come to your idea? What is open source for you? It's mainstream for your cybersecurity. It's not something proprietary. Actually, I would like to continue what Sergei said about free software. The factor of free for pay is not the main idea, because free software existed for quite a long time. But it doesn't matter. We use open source software. We compare it with proprietary solutions, and very often open source brings you a lot of benefits, and those benefits are not free of charge. It's convenient and it is customizable. We can always improve it if we need, and this is a very big benefit if you have R&D resource, if you have good engineers. Dmitry, anything else? Yandex? Well, yes, thank you. I can add a lot of things, actually. To be precise, I represent Yandex Cloud, but Yandex was initially focused on local developments, and almost everything that we have now are our own in-house developments. And security solutions are either open source or open source with our add-ons. We don't see any problems here. The main problem is availability of high-quality developers. This is the main thing. All the rest does work. Vladimir, so as a regulator, the company, the O company and the Y company, two technological giants, they can hire the best talents in the market, and they have the R&D resources that can improve open source. Most of the companies in the Russian market do not have such resources. I mean consumers of software, not vendors. How well can they use open source? First, I didn't ask that question beforehand. You sent me some question, but this one is new. It's really new. The ministry is quite positive about open source. We believe the more open source we have in the country, the better. Not just external libraries, but active participation with local repository. It's a good story because it increases our technological independence. We understand the next thing. Today, absolutely everything in all companies, big and small, in sites and IT systems, you have open source everywhere, absolutely. Apache, Pythons, MySQL, they are there. They are everywhere. Somebody asked me, what about cryptography and open source? Don't tell anyone about OpenSSL because it's open source and it's almost everywhere in encryption. So we all have to use open source. We have a lot of open source everywhere. Do we have to develop it? Yes, of course. Can small companies hire developers? No. We need a local Russian-based community. Open source was produced by community, was born by community, but I am a representative of government agencies and I cannot go there and build government-based open source. That would be a wrong thing to do. I say, alternatively, that we are ready to support open source. How can government support open source? Thank you. Denis, what about positive technologies? You develop your proprietary products, but maybe you also use some open source components. What about open source for you? Is it a competitor or an opportunity to push part of the problems to the open source community? I would say that open source is not free, of course. Different form factor. It may be free, but support is not free, never free. And positive technologies can build the same kind of product and distribute it and sell support services. We are geopoliticized now, and if we look beyond Russia, it wouldn't be easy to sell anything. Openness is about our technologies. We can demonstrate it and say it works, and we can improve it better than you if you take it. Do you mean that Positive is going to open your codes? No, don't be so fast. That would be too early. Good question. We have plans to open parts of our products because we need community. Community must be formed around something that can be contributed to. It's difficult to contribute to proprietary product. Talking about cybersec, there are 2 points. One is infrastructure, delivery, and second is knowledge. If you look at all products, you can have one or the other, but not the two things together. For very clever people, an open engine with a capability to contribute is something that a community can be formed around. As for the enterprise sector, it's another question, because the company, especially big company, can do it on its own. Whether to develop their own product or to buy a ready-made box solution, they can develop. Smaller company can buy a box product because they don't have the resources to develop. But, Positive can open some technologies to get community with their knowledge, which can be shared and sell on a wider scale than before. Thank you. Good question, actually. Positive Technologies said they are ready to open their codes, and 1 year later we're going to ask him, what have you closed in the previous year? Taras, what can you open your forks that you built on the basis of the open source? Can you open it for community like Google, like Facebook, Netflix, and other companies who are actively publishing in community their own security tools that some people use, others don't? But are you ready, Taras? Actually, we're not only ready, we're already doing it now. At Coda Social Hosting, we have the area where we publish interesting products and technologies that were born in our company, in Ozone, and something which can be useful and beneficial is already published, including security solutions. We use open source solutions in the company, and we develop tools and open it to the open source community. We take from open source and we contribute to open source, and we increase the total number of open source solutions. In which areas did you publish your tools? Security. In the recent years, an important subject is supply chain attacks. especially for the open source components. All internet consists of a lot of services that use a lot of open components, and the solution that we published long ago is about integration of supply chain analysis, which help the companies to monitor security of the components they use. Thank you, Dmitry. Well, from the viewpoint of security products, here we use them inside the company, but under certain conditions, why not? We could open something for a wider range of community members. Security solutions that we use in the company are based on open source, and if we publish them, they can be used in other companies as well. As for the company, it's more focused on the products that are used outside the company, but they are not about security. We have such products, the database, for example, which has a community around, then the community makes its contribution, but security is not the main target for such kind of publishing. Sergey, the question is to you. Colleagues are for opening and say it is good, but on the other hand, they give examples not related to security. ClickHouse, for instance, can be used in the in-house CM, big data security analytics, but it's not about security as such. Have you got a good security-based open source project example with the company saying, we are developing it, not community, the company. It says, this is open source, we published it, and we develop it. Just one addition. Perhaps it's easier for the positive to do it because it's focused on security. Our focus is different. We cannot publish everything that we use inside. We need R&D, we need competence, and everything depends on the competence. Well, we have a good area when open source became commercial, commercial became open source. Elastic, for instance, it's a database which now everyone has inside. No one agrees, no one admits. It's a good step, a bit toxic about licensing, but technically a good one, and you can build your socks on that. Seaway, Elinor, Verizon bought it and contributed. In security, it's a standard story. Database management system, Rapid7. In general, I am often asked, we see a lot of good stories about infrastructure and custom software. Why not security software? Why Nexus became Open Watson and then was broken? Security software has one component which others sometimes lack. It's a knowledge base. Without knowledge base, it wouldn't work properly. And we have to find a balance between the engine and the knowledge base. Suricata, for instance, which was mentioned and which all the vendors have. They found a good balance. There are community rules, there are additional rules, which are beneficial, but if you want to be at the cutting edge, you have to buy a commercial subscription. And on the one hand, this delays development a little bit. On the other hand, it gives an additional opportunity for them to develop commercially. Our model is, yes, we build good open source solutions, we contribute to them, we develop our own solutions, we open part of knowledge base which are sufficient to bring in benefits, but they cost the money. What about community? If there is a company that develops something, it invests in development, it hires good developers, it wants to earn the money, and it's a classical story that any vendor who supports open source has two branches. One commercial, Cisco, Snartom, Verizon with GoSIM, Elastic with Elastic, a lot of examples. Where is the community role, especially in Russia? Because in the West, there is a vendor who earns the money and helps to develop community. What about Russia? Because most of our vendors are truly proprietary and they are used to proprietary solutions. Can they find a solution that would help them to open their engines and databases and earn on services and rules only? So we can ask the vendor who is present here. My point of view is as follows. I talk to many companies and I will talk to more. There are a lot of solutions that need to be returned to the community. The open source has a trap. You take a version, you start working with it, you contribute, you invest your time and money, and then you see that the community is one step ahead. If you didn't contribute to the community before, well, you use the obsolete version like Windows 95 in the year 2000. And many Russian vendors face the same problem. Sometimes they lacked the time, others believe we don't want to give our knowledge to competition, but now we understand that we must consolidate, we must contribute to the community. If it is not just one vendor, but several vendors, they can build a good knowledge base, interesting for the wider community, like Surikat, for instance. They have a consortium of the companies that help them. There are big contributors. So this is the idea and this is the hope. And I hope, let me tell you one thing, using open source model will help many companies to cut cost, because they will not spend on a lot of money on closing their source code. Dennis, to continue, you are a vendor. What about the two branches of your solutions, the commercial one and the open source one? One is sold, the other brings you revenues from services only. CM, for instance, for us, is it a way for you? So do you see it as beneficial? Of course, this is an open source section. Don't criticize open source. But, well, what do you think, honestly? Honestly, we as a company feel one headache. Very clever people who could exchange knowledge do not do that on our products. there is a query language from GitHub for static analysis. When it appeared, the codes for QL was shared within a few hours. No vendor can include signatures on a 24/7 basis. It can be done by community only. Honestly, we are the vendors, but we sell our expertise, very good expertise. We have very good experts who can disclose vulnerabilities and eliminate them. The engine, the knowledge base, is our core that helps us to exist and develop. And of course, we cannot give away the engine, although we wouldn't lose the money there, because we have very few people who can write such engines, and they wouldn't buy it from us or from Kaspersky. As for the knowledge base, it's very difficult to distribute knowledge base for free, because this is our our benefit. I saw different approaches. One, when the knowledge base is published instantly for money, free at a later stage with a certain delay. So, and each of the products has its own way. Some should publish a little later, others could still sell some very specific subtle things all the time. Many vendors publish connectors, strikes, CI/CD, all those things. They publish it in open source community. They consist of just a few scripts. It's easier to customize than to buy it. For the vendor, it's moving away from the main focus. So the programmers say that it would be easier for them to protect their code. When I come to programmers and say, well, you can publish it, they say, oh, no, we need to clean it half a year later. So on the one hand, it requires more resources. On the other hand, it's more responsibility. It's an interesting situation because we cannot stop moving into open source. We are moving and we shall move there. But there are problems like what to do with knowledge bases, then what about programmers. It's striptease for the programmers.
Thank you, Vladimir. Actually, you'll be answering for the regulator today. So therefore, my question will be security for security, and more specifically about certification. Yes, I'm sorry. Regulators in this country like, unfortunately, that the products that they mark with an approved label, so they want it to come from a specific vendor, so that they should have a specific and ongoing support, and so that the vendor should be held responsible for removing vulnerabilities in the product, even if it's open source. So how much is the story, even though I understand it's more to your partners, but perhaps you have some information. How other regulators, including the Ministry of Digital Development, address a situation where open source is a community. There's no direct support with SLAs, just like in enterprise solutions, and it's done on best effort principle. So how can this be mapped against the regulators' requirements? Can we match open source and certification requirements, because without this, for a lot of corporates, this story will remain beautiful on paper. Yes, indeed, I'll probably have to answer for other regulators, and therefore they will be able to deny what I just say. Firstly, I love how Denis is speaking here. Denis, thank you very much. I remembered. Putting code to the open source is like a thing that developers should be ashamed of, and giving it to the government, not. Okay, at least you're frank. Now, what to do? There are 4 different concepts: open source, freely distributed software, trust, and security. So these are all different concepts. Open source, it doesn't mean that it is free, and free software doesn't mean it's going to be open source. At the same time, trust and security are also different terms, and if it is open source or free software, it can by default be either trusted or secure, about which other regulators are always trying to speak from the stage. So there was no verification was run for undocumented features. So nobody has sat in a certified lab and checked all the functions by the list. Once somebody does that, it's going to become trusted. I'm not even going to speak about security. That's the resilience of the software to different threats. So what to do about this? Because if we remember, originally I said Ministry of Digital Development does support open source, even in cybersecurity. There are 2 aspects here. First, it's quite normal practice in the market. Somebody say, I want to do that. They take open source and say, I am going to run this, and I'm going to make technical support and get it certified. Okay, we now get an owner, and this owner will be following the updating. But it ceases to be open source at this point. Yes, I agree. There's another approach. You can stop calling it SZI. Stop calling it information protection system. How go about that? We are building some information system. If it's not a national security-based system where everything should be certified, then you are just complying with the requirements. Let's say you have built something, created something, let's say a website, and then you read the requirement and says, so there should be a firewall, there should be an antivirus, and so on and so forth. There are these requirements. And all these additional requirements, so there are some additional requirements for your infrastructure, and everything has to be certified. It doesn't mean that you can't do something additionally. I never saw a situation that somebody would come to an organization and say, you have a WISP, which is not certified. So for the regulator, it doesn't matter. So they come and see that you use an uncertified solution. There's not. So therefore, you have software. Yes, you have. Can it be used? Yes, it can be used. So if you are using it for security purposes, then go do it. The main thing is that if you have decided that you are covering some necessary requirements, then in this case you have to go for certification and lose the open source status because you get your own fork. Maybe sometime down the road, maybe in a week, let's say a Ministry of Digital Development convenes and say, we have built a domestic repository which is trusted and secure. You're going to commit your code there, and like 2 institutes, 5 regulators, and 3 labs are going to make sure that it's good. So maybe it'll happen, and maybe we'll say thank you. Well, of course, people will say something. If not thank you, maybe something else. But Actually, Ministry of Digital Development has been thinking about the domestic repository. Yes, we are discussing inside how to make this domestic repository more trusted. But in this rush, so that all the software should be trusted and therefore secure, we are risking losing the whole concept of open source community. It's a question that I won't be able to answer today. Sergey, I just have a comment. Firstly, trust doesn't exist without responsibility. So therefore, in the certification model, that makes sense. The responsible entity should be included, because when you come to a regulator, you are saying, I swear I comply with these rules. So, and certification, no certification, but this goodwill that you are offering is not going to go away. If there are no people who are going to be prepared for this certification, the system won't work. So I don't see a problem about somebody taking open source and submit it for certification, because in essence, in the ideal world, certification should bring about an improvement of the product. Vulnerabilities will have been identified. For instance, somebody said the authentication is not implemented perfectly enough, so you correct, you patch it, and go on. So what's the problem? I don't see this problem of certification excluding open source. And a small comment, what I liked about it. For me, the real certification model is where this formal part can be made discreet. So I come once a year and say, I swear this version is certified, it's good, it meets your criteria. Whereas the technical verification as such should be continuous and could be spread in time, because what's its purpose? Is to correct me if I'm wrong. So essentially, the regulator should teach me to make my product a little bit better. And this should be done continuously. If I'm saying that I want to get a certificate for 3 years, so all the 3 years my product may be available, people will be able to look into it, find errors and correct me. I don't see any contradiction between the code being open source and certified. Except the situations when one of the regulators says that you can't open the source code because it goes against security. And Dmitry, you wanted to add something? Yes, a small comment. Whether to call it or not to use it in terms of to call it the information security systems, SZI in Russian coding. It's not really makes sense. It doesn't really make sense. You have to deal with certification in one way or the other. And maybe we're seeing that the regulatory frameworks are changing, and it's great. The regulators are starting to work actively on changing the regulations, and we're helping them to do that. It would be very good if, as part of this change, this should also be taken account of, so that life should become easier for companies which require certification, so that this kind of open source products could be used there. Because I think this area is quite a gray area. Dmitry, I had a question for you, and you've partly taken it. Say Yandex, because it hosts quite a lot of personal data systems, critical infrastructure sites. I'm sure customers are asking you all the time, how do you comply with the security requirements? And you have to be compliant with Orders 17, 2235, 31, and others, and they require these security things, and going away from this rigmarole is not always possible. So Vladimir said it's a good idea not to use the term SZI. That's information security systems and not to use cryptography, but use, let's say, use the word encoding. But the regulator may not agree. If you need, in terms of protection and compliance, to use cryptography to effect connection between different sites, you have to use certified cryptography on, well, to the Russian GOST. You use it, everything's fine, and you got an attestation for your system. And now tell me who with attestation system also submitted for Open SSL certification. Nobody has. This is to say that when we're using different components of information protection systems and others, we are not certifying everything at once. It never happens. Well, of course, it happens, but only very rarely in very serious systems. Yes, they need to do something. Like, for instance, to close the external perimeter. What does the government say? What is the government saying? So we're not going to check everything you've done, but on the perimeter, you'll have to use certified tools. The intrusion detection tool should also be certified. Okay, we're ticking the boxes. This doesn't preclude you to use additional tools and solutions. I've never seen a situation where they would tell, no, delete it, delete SSL. How come? It's cryptography, it's not certified. It's never happened. But you're threatening us, because attestation is done by a different regulator for whom encryption is an absolutely different thing. Okay, I had an example about MISP. MISP. We are not going, we won't be able to test the system with MISP. Is MISP a security tool or just a separate system? Well, it's a good example because there are no requirements to it. And for the regulator, it's not clear at all what's it about. We perfectly understand what's all about. So example by example, you can use example by example to find the right balance. But look, Vladimir, it appears that you're saying, hey guys, you must apply certified tools, so it's more about proprietary vendors. You won't be able to go away from that. But in addition, you can actually install a lot of open source tools that allow you to have additional levels of protection. So maybe people would like to go away from proprietary solutions at all and use open source everywhere, but they can't because the regulator says, don't do that. You have to use only what's been tested by us and is guaranteed. Well, firstly, these are the regulations today, and I can't argue with that. I couldn't have argued had I not known, but this is the way the regulations are built, and I think it's right. My previous examples are about what people are doing today, what's going to happen tomorrow. I've already shared that. Maybe we'll get some open source, we'll have some open source to which we'll have a certain level of trust. Then this open source code will also be able to use. The story with the certification of open source, I perfectly understand that it stops to be open source code at this moment, just at this moment when it got an owner, it has certified that it's no longer an open source. So in which direction one should think? We have to think about the situation that the government is never in a situation that everything used to be bad and tomorrow we're writing war and peace. So everything happens in steps. If you take a look at the process that's happening in the country, all the different laws passed and decrees and orders, we can find a certain progress. There's a certain process to replace the security tools from unfriendly nations. Then we'll have a requirement to remove the security tools from neutral nations. And it's only after that, in this paradigm, we'll find open source. And only at the end, we'll have fully Russian-made software with certification. We perfectly understand that's life. It doesn't happen that today everything's bad and tomorrow we have everything covered. So it just doesn't work this way. So therefore, we are asking to at least follow this chain of events. If there's no Russian software, then go to open source. There are additional requirements, but open source is an additional requirement, which is very good. And then we start talking about the proprietary software abroad. Thank you. And this brings us to the end of this discussion. It passed quite quickly. Maybe it's going to be the last question. Taras, I'll start with you. The situation with open source code verification for backdoors on other undocumented features. We know the story with Node IPC that happened recently. Somebody that had the interest contributed a malicious component there that started deleting files that it could reach. It's not the only story. In the internet, there are at least 3 lists of such malicious open source components. How to verify the code that other people maintain to make sure that there's nothing bad there for our infrastructure. I'd like to say that this case is quite good and very relevant. But how is it done, like in this company? We have a process implemented to take all components that we take from open source repositories and verify them. And we perfectly understand that all the bricks that the open source solutions are built on, their security is equal to the security of your system as code. You can't take some open source components from the world because it makes the development faster. Of course, there should always be a process to audit and to verify what specifically you take from the open source world. For instance, what's the history of this project? What the code is like? To run the audit of the code in a literal sense. And in sum, all these activities allow you to get more confidence about these products. But also, you need to, you're going to update it. The development of these components is not going to stop. So therefore, you need to maintain monitoring of these components with regard to the vulnerabilities. And I assure you that all developers who are present here, a large part of the modern world, are using third-party code. So it's both a boon and a threat for security. Okay, thank you. So coming back to IPC, it's obvious that it couldn't have been tested rather than through visual analysis. How to do that, especially for those companies who don't have the professionals to do that? Well, actually, I had an example a little bit earlier in a different company, an absolutely similar example, but that was a contractor. And again, from activist considerations, it was contracted and everything was being done, and then so everything crashed, and a lot of efforts had to be applied to remove the outcomes. So open source or not open source is the same. It's just open source has a broader coverage. The question is about the following: whether you take open source codes or closed codes, you're taking the responsibility. It's a matter of trust. If you take a certified security tool, then the vendor has said it's okay, and the government has confirmed it's okay. And when you just take something from a vendor, it's what's written in the EULA, as is. Like, for instance, it has the as is clause or anything else. If you take open source code from Git, this is the license agreement, and all the responsibility rests with you. And here, that basically is quite an important task for the vendor who uses open source solutions. Verify the updates and also use the formal traces of who committed, how and when. And of course, certain commits from certain countries will have to be analyzed in more detail. So this supply chain that brings a lot more problems should be mentioned here, because you just can't see deep enough what is part of your code, who has contributed to it. You see the basic code, but then in three dependency hops, you see some library that uploads you don't know what. Indeed, it takes a lot of effort, but again, it's back to the question of trust. Okay, thank you, Dmitry. And by the way, the Five Eyes Alliance has issued a bulletin that now attacks on providers have become more frequent, services and the supply chain problems. How does Yandex Cloud solve the problem with this external open source software that you must use? In Yandex Cloud, there's a very strong internal team in terms of security review, and the process is there. And as we said, what you need resources, competencies, and good professionals. Because even if you use open source code for your developments, and because it's a critical part, so we're paying a lot of attention to it. And indeed, so this visual review does produce results. So manually, there are quite strong professionals who manually find such things that you are surprised to see. Yes, you need a process, you need the people, and you need the time. And considering a time to market and everything else, this, of course, poses a problem. But there's no other way out. Okay, got that. When you become a certifier, you start understanding their pain. Yes, clear. Vladimir, in continuation of the same subject, in 2016, they hacked the Linux Me site. In 2018, they hacked the Begin to Linux website, repository, through backdoors. If Ministry of Digital Development is going to become the state repository, so who will carry responsibility if somebody introduces a backdoor and these malicious updates start rolling out across the country? Actually, it goes well with the previous question. The idea, I think, has just been born, and so we may support it. But look, open source. Today, this session, I mentioned this word trust during this session quite a lot. By the way, nobody is responsible for trust. For software security, they do, but not for trust. But I have been mentioning this word quite often, so often today that I liked it. Open source is built on trust. And for quite a long time, open source has been suffering from this. It had a lot of problems with trust. It's been discussed quite a lot, not only in Russia, but all over the world. And in the past 3 months, the Institute of Trust has been just shattered. So what to do? I was listening to the previous speaker. What to do with this? Open source is a community, and a community is a story about collective unconscious. You have to fight it with a collective irresponsibility. And so I think it's the story about the bug bounty of open source. So what I'm talking about, maybe you should make not the contributors, but the main users. So you use libraries, some kind of libraries or tools or features. You should contribute your effort into the overall bug bounty effort. I think Yandex has started to be more nervous. Yes, first I heard is that everything is used by Yandex. They ran code review. So I'm actually jotting down everything I've heard here. So this is the story that we have the tools even today that are used too broadly in open source. The backdoors there, affect the entire economy, the entire civil infrastructure. And this is the story about why not to try to collect this thing and to implement it. This will also be a tool to ensure the security of domestic repository. You should use team efforts to protect from team problems. So what should customers do who now come back to the topic of open source? So running the conclusions is a strong mission. I actually had a question of how Vladimir combines the desire to use the word trust and also to jot down what everybody said. Nevertheless, let me suggest some ideas. I know one regulator had an idea of certifying not the projects, but the pipeline of building the product and the process. So once you add something new in the process, the problems most probably should be solved. The stack implemented that is just what they claim. I don't know how realistic the story is. Actually, it will take us for another hour of discussions. But coming back to the question, when we're talking about supply chain and commits to open source that have been initially malicious, we have used this quite a lot and included some verification algorithm in our product. And by the way, there's a technical presentation about this in another session, but very simplistically, I think the impact that the manufacturers want to make may be quite different, and it's quite different to find the signature is difficult, but the geography check is much simpler than finding an impact. Other than that, I don't see that there's anything special that must make a security software vendor against a regular IT vendor. So code reviews are also a certain thing that needs to be done. I don't believe that without guys like that, any vendor can do without. Colleagues, let's run the results of this discussion. It's obvious that in 50 minutes that we had, it was impossible for us to cover all the topics about open source code, applying it to the current realities, because the reality have changed considerably over the past 2 months. But the most important things that we could hear from our colleagues is that you need to have the people. And just next door to the section, there was a closed section about human resources, where this problem was also discussed. And indeed, it's a core problem. And I hope that thanks to the Ministry of Digital Development and efforts and other regulators, we're going to have more professionals who will not be who will not just have habits going abroad to different conferences to purchase foreign solutions, but they will be they will get the ability to use open source solutions and do it in a more trusted environment, in a more trusted mode than it used to be done in the past. So without the people, unfortunately, this whole idea will not fly. And one thing that remains to hope for, that in the next year before the next PhD days, we'll get some best practices to use open source, not in private projects, not in technology companies, but in rank and file players in the market who have now found themselves face to face with the dire reality now that the foreign vendors have left the Russian market. Many thanks to you for the participation. Those who've been in the room, those who've watched us online, and many thanks to the colleagues responding my provocative questions. And till we see again in our next meetings during PhD days. Thank you very much.